podcast, digging beneath the surface to uncover the hidden ideas that form us, the church, and our culture. I'm Brian Fisher. This is episode 66. Everybody hates Brian. Just a few notes before we get started today. As a reminder, this podcast is designed to be listened to in order from the beginning. It's a slow, progressive journey into deep discipleship, and new episodes build on previous episodes. It's designed that way on purpose. You're obviously free to listen to or read whatever episodes you want, but just be aware you may run the risk of missing certain things or hearing certain terms and concepts that have been detailed in earlier episodes. Jessica and I are in a greenhouse, and one of the common comments our group makes about the podcast is that it's dense. I think that's meant to be a good thing. There's a lot packed into most episodes, so take your time working through the seasons. There's no rush. You're not missing anything if you want to repeat an episode or decide to take some time to just bake in one topic or idea. Dr. Tim Boswell was on our last episode, and off-air he politely informed me that in episode 64, I repeatedly used the word chiastic as a noun, when in fact it's an adjective. A piece of literature is not a chiastic, it has a chiastic structure. The proper noun form of the word is chiasmus. Apologies for my error. It wasn't my first, and it certainly won't be my last. I've made the correction on the blog, though for those of you who instead listen to the audio, the error will remain. I was so glad Doc corrected me. I was not glad that Kyle was in the room, because now I'll never hear the end of it. Comedian Chris Rock created and narrated a sitcom called Everybody Hates Chris that ran from 2005 to 2009. It was semi-autobiographical in that it shared stories of Chris's growing up in New York City with his mom, dad, and two younger siblings. Each episode followed the same formula. Chris gets into some sort of difficult or challenging situation at school or home or in his neighborhood, and by the end of the half hour, he's blamed for whatever happened. Doesn't matter if he's actually responsible for it or not, he's blamed for it. That's pretty much the way I feel about my conversations with folks about the end times. Doesn't matter what I ask, what I say, or how I try to explore the various perspectives, by the end of the conversation, everybody hates Brian. So why are we talking about it? Well, here's the deal. This entire season, we are exploring the first primary problem, the forgotten kingdom. At Soil and Roots, we maintain the primary message of the New Testament, and a prominent idea in the Old is the kingdom of God. So the kingdom should be Christianity 101, but it generally isn't. We seem to have forgotten Jesus' primary mission. Wrestling with this kingdom is a means for us to connect with God and others and even ourselves. It's a critical part of this journey we're on to discover the more to the Christian life than what we typically experience. All right, so far so good. But why do we have to look at various perspectives of the end times, especially when these discussions can get technical, emotional, and potentially divisive? Well, because our assumptions and ideas about the end times impact our ideas about the kingdom, and our ideas about the kingdom impact our spiritual formation. We're integrated beings living in an integrated world. Whether they're well developed or not, our views of the end times impact our 8 indicators and the way we see and operate in the world. Now, it's become fairly common for some churches and theologians to avoid preaching or discussing or even introducing the 4 main views of the end times. When I was growing up, it was a regular topic of conversation at church, even at school and in the culture. That seems to have cooled quite a bit for a variety of reasons. Let's face it, discussions about the end times can be rabbit holes from which very few rabbits actually return. There is wisdom in not discussing the 4 primary end times views in certain settings. Some of the theologians and thinkers I follow refuse to publicly state a specific view, choosing rather to focus on how we should live in the kingdom. And most of this season is going to focus on that, what it means to live in the kingdom. I get that, though again, our ideas about how we should live in the kingdom are related to and influenced by our perspective of the end times. We need somewhere to wrestle with these types of important topics, even if it may not be in our churches. And I fear, but I can't confirm, that an underlying reason why so many churches avoid very important but potentially controversial topics isn't so much about protecting their flocks as it is protecting their balance sheets. So it seems a popular assumption nowadays is that our view of the end times is peripheral. In an effort to cultivate unity and avoid unnecessary confrontation, let's just leave the peripheral issues aside and focus on what's central? Well, are end times views peripheral? Well, it depends on what we mean by peripheral. Is a supposedly accurate view of the end times necessary for salvation? Well, no. But is that all our current Christian culture has come down to? As long as someone is saved and tries to live a moral life, does that now constitute what's central? We're integrated beings living in an integrated world. We can't simply divorce our end times views from the rest of our discipleship, as much as we might like to. It seems that the list of things in the Bible we should no longer talk about is growing. There are 4 different views on communion. There are 4 distinct views on baptism. Did you know there are at least 7 perspectives regarding Christ's atoning work on the cross? Talk about a can of worms. How many views are there on worship styles, on church architecture? How about creation, or the power of the enemy, or spiritual warfare, or the gifts of the Spirit, or women serving in the church? If we continue to grow the list of things we won't talk about because they might be divisive, we might just end up segmenting ourselves into all sorts of denominations and independent churches and groups, and we might just keep splitting up whenever someone says something we don't agree with. No, wait a second. I think we misunderstand what unity means. Unity doesn't mean only hanging out with people who agree with my position. It means loving each other, celebrating what we have in common, and intentionally learning about and respectfully dialoguing about things on which we may have differences. There's a difference between unity and a passive détente. If our unconscious approach to our journey to become more like Jesus means we're simply going to maintain a growing list of things we passively agree not to talk about in order to keep the peace, well, here's an interesting question. How does that work out in a marriage? Let's say a husband and a wife over time keep a conscious or unconscious list of things not to be discussed. Money, politics, sex, how to raise the kids, the husband's passivity, the wife's nagging. Are those things peripheral? Well, in one sense they are, if the reduced idea of marriage is simply to stay married. But is it good? Does it cultivate oneness? Does it create a relationship that flourishes and blossoms if they keep a running list of peripheral topics they silently agree not to bring up? You're not going to find a single Christian marriage book, counselor, or seminar worth their salt that thinks that's a good idea. This is one of my concerns about modern Christianity. We're married, quote unquote, but in order to avoid healthy conflict and confrontation and growth, we just keep a long list of things we just aren't going to talk about, and so the relationship stagnates. The courageous marriage, the truly unifying marriage, appropriately and intentionally dives into the differences, not always for the purpose of persuading each other to reach the same conclusion, but rather for deepening the relationship. The husband and wife may not end up agreeing with each other, but they will have a far better understanding of their spouse, most likely a fuller appreciation of their motivations, and an ease of some tension, because at least each party has a clear, comprehensive understanding of the other person's heart. A marriage is not about compelling both parties to agree on everything, it's about deepening the relationship towards unity and oneness. We grow through healthy, mature conflict. We grow through wrestling with God, with others, with ourselves. The name Israel means wrestles with God. Wrestling with these things changes us. That's the whole point. If we avoid the conflict, we avoid the growth. That's not the path of a deep disciple. A deep disciple invites and engages in wrestling with God and others and ourselves. Now, let's be up front. Many of us would rather not experience this conflict, this wrestling, whether in our marriages or in our close Christian communities regarding our beliefs. However, we need to explore why we tend to avoid it. So let's start with a very high-level view of the 4 perspectives of the end times, and then we'll dig beneath the surface of those convictions. The way the 4 perspectives of the end times comes to those of us who aren't full-time biblical scholars is generally how many ideas in the air eventually make their way into our soils. Powerful perspectives are introduced and developed over time through various cultural mountains, in this case the cultural mountains of church and education. Over time, influential ideas come out of the institutions and they make their way down to the rest of us. That's how end times views work. They are continually being researched and reviewed and explored and investigated and updated by very bright scholars who publish papers, teach at conferences, write books, and put out videos. This is their specialty. Those of us who don't have the time or desire To dive into church history and various methods of interpreting Scripture, rely on our trusted sources, usually our pastor, or our preferred scholars, or internet teachers, or our families. By the time these views and ideas get to most of us, they've been distilled. And those of us at the bottom of this idea process function from some level of trust that those who distill them know what they're doing. We aren't necessarily walking around with all of the I's dotted and T's crossed. We pull bits and pieces from what we hear at church or what we read, unless studying the end times is a personal hobby. In order to talk about these views, I have to make some generalizations about them. There are a large number of variations and nuances between the four views and inside each of the four views, but we're not going to go into that much detail. So if you hold passionately to one of these views, most likely you're going to disagree with even some of these generalizations. Remember, everybody hates Brian. 3 of the views are named around when Christ will return related to the biblical idea of the millennium found in the book of Revelation. Now, the term millennium itself is debated. Some hold to the idea it means a literal 1,000-year period, while others believe it just means a long period of time. All 4 views hold to the second coming of Christ. Yippee, we can all agree on that. However, a few of the views hold to a separate event called the rapture. The rapture is usually defined as a secret rescue of believers in Christ either before or during an upcoming period of terrible tribulation on the earth prior to Jesus wrapping everything up. Nothing about end times discussion is ever easy, so the word rapture can be used in a few different ways. But for our purposes, I'm using the word rapture in the way I just described, as a rescue event separate from the second coming of Christ when he comes to fully consummate the kingdom. Because scholars and theologians and doctors and lawyers love inventing and using long words to convince us of their intelligence, none of the labels for these perspectives are particularly short. The 3 views named in relation to the millennium are Premillennialism, Postmillennialism, and Amillennialism. Premillennialism holds that Christ will return prior to the millennium. At least the label makes sense. They generally hold to a literal 1,000-year time frame where Christ will reign on the earth. Some premillennialists, but not all, hold to the idea of a rapture and a time of intense worldwide suffering and destruction prior to the millennium. Postmillennialism holds to the idea that Christ will return after the millennium. After. This label also makes some sense. Post-mills maintain that the world will become increasingly Christianized, leading to the triumphant second coming of Christ. Post-mills don't hold to the idea of a rapture or an upcoming period of worldwide war and collapse. This third view's name, Amillennialism, doesn't really make a lot of sense. The in the word means no, so someone with this view does not hold to the idea of a literal 1,000-year period. But it's not that they don't believe in the millennium at all. All mills believe the millennium refers to a period of time between Christ's ascension and the second coming, so we would be living in the millennium right now. Instead of all-millennialism, some use the phrase realized millennium, but that hasn't really stuck. Like post-millennialism, all mills don't hold to the idea of a rapture or an upcoming period of intense tribulation. They tend to take tribulation as a matter of course. Just to make sure we're thoroughly confused, the fourth perspective doesn't reference the millennium in its name. It's referred to as dispensationalism. A dispensation is a period of time, and this view is named that way because it views the story of the Bible occurring in big blocks of time, or dispensations. It's generally considered to be a subset of the first view, premillennialism, so much so that although I'm outlining 4 views here, sometimes you'll find sources that only outline 3. As one dispensational writer put it, not all premillennialists are dispensationalists, but all dispensationalists are premillennialists. And we wonder why most of us don't bother to dig into end times views. The reason I and many others think dispensationalism deserves its own category is because of its enormous influence in America over the past 100 years. It has accomplished what none of the other views have. It successfully influenced not only the church, but all 7 mountains of culture, and in some pretty profound ways. Dispensationalism holds to the secret rapture of the church from the earth. They hold to a time of terrible tribulation in the future, and they view the nation of Israel as separate and distinct from the New Testament church. So dispensationalists and some premillennialists place special value and attention on the modern-day nation of Israel and its role in the present and the future. So here are some things about all four positions. Again, premillennialism, dispensationalism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism. Number one, they all agree on some things such as the fact that Jesus wins. Number two, obviously they don't agree on many things. They don't all agree on the existence or timing of a future rapture and a period of great tribulation. They don't always agree on the progression of the world between now and when Jesus consummates the kingdom, when we head off into the new heaven and the new earth. So dispensationalists view the world as heading towards a time of great chaos and bloodshed and upheaval prior to the second coming, while postmillennialism holds the idea the world is ultimately winding up and becoming more Christianized. Obviously, those are two pretty different views. Premills may vary in their view of where the world is headed, but tend to see a future time of tribulation ahead, and amills tend to see the world moving more sort of in cycles. Many people I run into don't realize such differing views even exist, and that makes some sense. If you grew up in an environment or go to a church that holds to amillennialism, you may not know what a rapture is and why some Christians are so interested in current events in the Middle East. If you grew up in or go to a dispensational church, you may be stunned. Some Christians reject the idea of a rapture and aren't particularly interested in modern-day Israel. In many cases, these outward signs of these end times views aren't even that specific. Some Christians have a vague notion they should be paying attention to the news and watching for various signs because the world is heading towards catastrophe, while others wonder what all the fuss is about. Okay, 3. In general, premillennialism and dispensationalism have a lot in common. As I mentioned, dispensationalism is generally considered a subset of premillennialism. Likewise, amillennialism and postmillennialism have some things in common. They share some underlying assumptions and conclusions. Number 4. There are various subcategories and interpretations within the perspectives themselves, and in some cases they're named. For example, different types of dispensationalism are generally recognized: traditional, revised, and the somewhat newer progressive dispensationalism. Number 5, every perspective has undergone some measure of change over the years, some more than others. Various influences impact theological scholars, including new findings in archaeology, studies of various ancient manuscripts and their original languages, and the ongoing debates and dialogues within the perspectives themselves. Again, these types of changes normally take a while to get to the rest of us, if they get to us at all. Ideas that are generated in the elite cultural institutions tend to take a long time to seep all the way down into our individual hearts. And 6, the various perspectives have ebbed and flowed in popularity and geography throughout time. I was listening to a podcast hosted by a premillennialist, and he thought that somewhere around 50% of Christians are dispensational in one form or other at present, at least in this part of the world. If you study church history, you'll find different variations of perspectives in varying degrees of popularity in various parts of the world. Clear as mud. As usual, I've included a number of sources in the endnotes for the written blog for this episode, so if you want to read more, you can find some of those there. But frankly, you can just search online for any of these terms and you'll be presented with more information than you can possibly consume. So why don't we normally connect our end times views with our spiritual formation, our discipleship, even if we do acknowledge we're integrated people living in an integrated world? Why is the end times on the list of things we shouldn't talk about? Why does that list seem to be growing? Well, here at Soil and Roots, we explore the hidden unconscious ideas that form us, so let's dig beneath our belief statements, even about the end times, for just a bit. Years ago, I was friends with a guy, and over time, I began to notice a distinct pattern in our conversations. Almost every time we got together, he would make mention of how much money he made. It didn't matter what we were talking about, he would somehow insert the fact that he was financially successful. We could be talking about oranges, or sports, or architecture, and he would steer the conversation around to his financial success. I don't think he was conscious that he was doing it. He's a Christian, so he would use Christian phrases. God has really blessed us. God has allowed us to flourish. I'm so grateful to God that he's allowed me to provide so generously for my family and to give so generously to the church. We all know the lingo. As deep disciples, we practice listening to hearts and not just words. We explored this in Season 2. A deep disciple explores God's heart, the hearts of others, and our own hearts. We practice listening carefully to not only what's being said, but to what's not being said, how things are said, and patterns of things that are said. So I've been practicing trying to listen to people's hearts. Over time, I became interested not in learning about how much money my friend makes, but why he has a desperate need to be seen as wealthy by those around him. What ideas and desires were driving his heart indicators? Remember, our hearts reveal their genuine ideas through our 8 indicators: our thoughts, emotions, behaviors, relationships, words, health, time, and money. His powerful unconscious desire to be viewed as wealthy suggests a deep sense of insecurity and of attempting to find his value, his identity, in other people versus resting in his identity in Jesus. In other words, his words were saying one thing, but his heart was communicating something entirely different. This week, I came across a video featuring a well-known, highly influential theologian. He was on a panel discussion exploring another topic we're not supposed to talk about: the gifts of the Spirit, things like prophecy and tongues and healing, teaching, administration. The panel was exploring whether some or all of the gifts mentioned in the Bible have ceased. This theologian interrupted the discussion and said something to this effect: "Of all the people I've met who say they experienced these gifts, I've never come across one with the right theology. That should tell you something about the gifts of the Spirit today." Wow. We've all heard some arrogant things from the lips of some theologians and celebrity pastors, but that one probably makes my top 10. Though from a heart view perspective, arrogance is usually a sign of which deeper heart reality? A profound insecurity. Or in the language we use here at Soil and Roots, distorted and diminished ideas of identity and value. I often find the most dogmatic people to be the least secure. People who insist, who loudly pound on pulpits, bully or otherwise, and who demand that their perspective is the only correct interpretation are often dealing with much deeper heart conditions, and they generally don't know it. I'm not arguing against biblical orthodoxy or the reality of objective truth, but I think you get what I mean. I've wrestled with these challenges as I attempt to journey into deep discipleship. That's one of our core characteristics, a willingness to be brutally self-aware. Do I bring the same things up over and over again with people, even if it has nothing to do with the conversation? If so, why do I do that? Here's a tough question. Do we hold so tightly to some of our biblical positions because we're convinced of their accuracy, or also because to do so provides our hearts with a sense of validation, affiliation with a pastor we love or a celebrity teacher whom we admire? I have friends who strongly identify with each of the 4 end times views: premill, dispensational, amill, and postmill. I network with a lot of pastors, and I have pastor friends representing all 4 views. At times, it has been difficult for me to find people who, if they have defined in certain views of the end times, are actually willing to wrestle with those views. And by listening to their hearts, I've realized the reason why it's difficult has basically nothing to do with their actual viewpoint. For many people, the views themselves, or the people they admire who hold these views, provide a deep-seated need for security, for validation, for identity, for value. And so to engage in dialogue that may question or even threaten those perspectives is not a matter of intellectual discussion. For many of us, it rattles our hearts. So here's an example. A few years ago, a friend of mine came to me because he wanted to explore his view of the end times, and he supposedly wanted to get my thoughts. Now, I'm a naturally curious person, and over the years, I've developed some very probing, deep, difficult questions about each of the end times perspectives. So with his permission, I began asking him about his views, not in an attempt to try to persuade him otherwise or even indicate my agreement or disagreement. I was simply trying to understand how his story, how other influences led to the views he had, and how his views fit into his overall discipleship. However, as soon as he realized I was asking some things that didn't immediately resonate with his perspective, he effectively ended the conversation. His body language made it clear he was uncomfortable. I don't know if he was aware there were other views than his, but it was clear he didn't want to know anything about them. Well, why? Because his heart was afraid. He was insecure. He was afraid a point might be made or a thought raised that might cause him to question his own perspective, and he just wasn't ready for that. We often ask for other perspectives or views not because we actually want to learn or to be challenged or to wrestle, but because our hearts are desperately desiring validation. And as soon as our hearts realize they may not be validated, our 8 indicators begin to show it. I can now recognize this behavior because I've exhibited this behavior. I like to be right or correct as much as the next person. I wish I had known the noun form of chiastic prior to episode 64. This is what makes me wonder if our lack of Christian unity is always about the top-level issues themselves. I don't think so. I think our propensity to create long lists of things we're not going to talk about is far more about our hearts than our heads. It may relate more to an epidemic of hearts who fear being proven wrong, or inadequate, or uninformed, or embarrassed. It's a fear that's buried deep into our stories. Our hearts are confused. We somehow assume being right means being valuable. Thank God that's not the case, because I can guarantee you one thing. We're all wrong about a lot of things. This fear comes up out of our hearts in at least two ways. Either we get aggressive and express our extraordinary certainty by claiming that our view is the only biblical one, or we simply disengage and refuse to consider other perspectives. The theologian who insisted anyone who experiences certain gifts of the Holy Spirit is obviously wrong is an example of the first. My friend who asked me to talk about end times and then shut down the conversation is an example of the second. And I can point to incidents in my own life where I've done both. So in either case, it's just easier to bunker down with our camp and spend time with people who we agree with. It tends to make us feel better to listen to our favorite internet preacher who, with great authority and conviction, assures us that our perspective is correct. There is a far better third approach, but it requires us to dig beneath our favorite perspectives and confront the hidden ideas and desires in our hearts. We could instead take the risk of truly saturating ourselves in the views of others in order to understand their hearts. I'm pretty sure this is the idea Paul was advocating when he talked about becoming all things to all people in order to save some. We immerse ourselves in their culture, their set of ideas, in order to better relate to them, in order to better love them, even if it means risking our own sense of identity and value. I've become increasingly convinced that our doctrinal differences may not nearly be as much about our theological statements as they are about our heart conditions. Exploring both is the path of a deep disciple. Let's say you attend a church that is public and forthright about their view of the end times. That's fantastic. Kudos to them for taking the risk. Would your church consider hosting a civil and amicable debate every year or 3, featuring a scholar representing each of the 4 views? And maybe your pastor is the scholar representing your church's views. Since so many people are interested and fascinated with the end times, and they are, wouldn't it be deeply enriching for a congregation and even the public to be exposed to all 4 views and to watch the scholars wrestle with them? Better yet, the debate could allow the congregation to ask questions and interact with the scholars. Why wouldn't a church that stands firm on a perspective want to host such a debate? I suppose a first response might be that they want to protect their flock from incorrect views. Well, good luck with that, considering we all have access to any views we want online. But if you're convinced your view is the correct one, a debate should be a fantastic way to show why that's the case, as well as provide great talking points to your congregation on how to address the other viewpoints. Seems like some theologians and church leaders who hold firmly to their end times views are content to sit in their own communities and sometimes throw stones through social media and short little video clips instead of sitting down in an appropriate civil environment to actually wrestle with these things with other respected colleagues. Speaking of throwing stones, a few friends of mine follow an up-and-coming group who identify as Premillennialists, though with a few twists. This group believes Israel and the church are separate, and that there is a pending worldwide collapse on the horizon, and according to them, it's imminent. However, they've concluded there is no rapture, no secret rescue for the church before or during this period of intense suffering. So Christ will return to reign for 1,000 years, but we're all going to experience extraordinary bloodshed and war and worldwide collapse between now and then. So as usual, I asked some questions about the group, and my friends sent me to their website and podcast, so I dug in. Their speakers are very sharp, convicted, passionate. I enjoyed learning about their position. However, as is unfortunately common, they criticized all of the other positions, though it appeared they didn't really understand most of them. One of the speakers claimed that at least 2 other perspectives were extra-biblical and unbiblical. Now, these 2 phrases are often employed by people holding to one particular end times view about people holding to other views. They are unbiblical or extra-biblical. Okay, as I've mentioned before, every single sermon you and I have ever heard is, by definition, extra biblical. Unless you go to a church that does nothing but read the Bible during the sermon, every message, book, podcast, lecture, course, Sunday school class, Bible study, and small group is extra biblical. Unless all you do is sing the Psalms, every hymn or worship chorus you've ever sung is extra biblical. All 4 end times perspectives feature terms, ideas, and assumptions that are extra biblical. We can't possibly attempt to interpret, experience, or apply Scripture without commenting on it, attempting to categorize it, and trying to make sense of it. If you want to get really crazy, the order of the books of the Bible, the names of some of the books, and the chapters and verse numbering systems can all be considered extra biblical. Do we want to talk about different Bible translations? It's a term that's meant to cast dispersion on perspectives we don't agree with, and unfortunately, sometimes it's effective. But it's essentially meaningless. What about the claim that other perspectives are unbiblical? Well, Webster defines that as contrary to or unsanctioned by the Bible. I'm not an end-times scholar, nor do I ever wish to be, though I read and study a lot. So right now, I'm reading a dispensational book about how they interpret the Bible. I'm reading a postmillennial book about how they view biblical prophecy. In episode 64, I quoted from a book I just finished by George Eldon Ladd. He was a premillennialist. As much as I may or may not resonate with some of these perspectives, I would feel very, very uncomfortable claiming that any of the scholars who have helped form or communicate their perspectives are contrary to or unsanctioned in their efforts to interpret the Bible. D.L. Moody was considered a dispensationalist. He was a critical founder and driver of the modern international missions and Bible school movements. If we aren't dispensationalists, are we going to claim Moody was contrary to the Bible? One of the greatest thinkers, philosophers, and theologians in American history, Jonathan Edwards, was a postmillennialist. That perspective is a minority view today, but it wasn't always. Are we going to claim Edwards wasn't familiar with or somehow abused his Bible? What about Charles Spurgeon or John Piper or Francis Schaeffer, all some form of premillennialists? How about J.I. Packer, the author of one of the greatest books of our era, Knowing God? He was an amillennialist. Was he unbiblical? I think much greater charity, thoughtfulness, and compassionate critique may be in order when we evaluate these end times perspectives. With due respect, some of the greatest biblical scholars and theologians in recent history have come to at least 4 different conclusions. Before charging any one of them as being extra or unbiblical, we may want to dig a bit deeper. I think a great step forward for modern Christianity would be to head back to high school debate club. If you were in the club, chances are your teacher gave you a simple instruction when you were preparing for your event. Learn your opponent's position as well, if not better, than your own. If we want to adopt one of the 4 perspectives and really advocate for it, great. We should also dive deeply into the other 3, and not just accept some bullet points from a website with which we happen to agree. I'm often shocked by the criticisms I read by authors and speakers who hold firmly to one position. They often misrepresent or misunderstand the other views, hopefully not intentionally. And we should give all 4 positions the benefit of the doubt. That doesn't mean they're all correct. They can't be, because some of them hold to very opposite ideas. It does mean we accept that those who really get into the views have an earnest desire to seek God, understand His Word, and teach what they hold to be a correct interpretation. Sometimes it's better to be wrong and bold than correct and timid. All right, so what conclusions might we draw so far? Number 1, we might need to look at the laundry list of things we're reluctant to talk about, both in our marriages and our Christian communities. If we keep growing the list of things we leave aside for the sake of some concept of unity, we may actually be missing out on opportunities to grow in our love, our concern, our empathy, our understanding of each other. Unity and passive détente are 2 different things. Number 2, we may not have even been aware of it, but there are 4 prominent views of the end times. They have some things in common, though they have some profound differences. And they have a meaningful impact on our spiritual formation, so they deserve to be explored. Let's also recognize that what you and I tend to absorb are distilled versions of these perspectives, and we lean on our trusted resources to help us make sense of them. Number 3, we should approach the end times and any other strongly held perspectives with humility, charity, and grace. It's fine to be passionate and convicted about our views, but let's be generous with our approach. All four views have developed over time by some of the finest minds and intentional hearts over decades, if not centuries. If we're going to be critical, and we have every right to be, let's do so with the mindset of a debate club member, someone who has saturated themselves in their opponent's positions so that if need be, we could argue all sides persuasively. And if we're practicing deep discipleship, we recognize our theological beliefs are not simply a product of our studies. We are integrated beings living in an integrated world. The hidden ideas in our hearts impact our beliefs, our stories, our upbringings, our current experiences, and our relationships impact our theological beliefs. In other words, our views of the end times are influenced by two things we explored back in Season 1: ideas in the air and ideas in the soil. If we're unwilling or anxious about exploring other views, why? Is it because we're certain we're correct, or because our hearts have a desperate need to be certain we're correct? And let's make sure we consider the underlying assumptions and conclusions of the scholars who have developed and are developing the four primary views of the end times. Because as we move forward, we're going to discover the differences in the four views really aren't so much about isolated Bible verses as they are about much deeper questions. What is the Bible? What is its overarching narrative? How should the Bible be read and interpreted? Even when it comes to exploring these four views, we need to dig way beneath the surface. As N.T. Wright noted, quote, "Anyone who has worked within biblical scholarship knows, or ought to know, that we biblical scholars come to the text with just as many interpretive strategies and expectations as anyone else, and that integrity consists not of having no presuppositions, but of being aware of what one's presuppositions are, and of the obligation to listen to and interact with those who have different ones." End quote. In other words, let's get to wrestling. Thanks for listening. If you like the podcast, share the podcast. If you like the podcast, please rate the podcast. If you don't like the podcast, don't rate the podcast. If you'd like more information on soil and roots and greenhouses, check out soilandroots.org and feel free to reach out to us at fish@soilandroots.org, and we'll see you next time.